In the pristine enclave of Oakridge Estates, Linda Wilkinson, the self-appointed guardian of HOA regulations, was about to make the mistake of a lifetime. What started as a routine patrol to preserve the neighborhood's aesthetic standards spiraled when she spotted a massive customized black SUV parked in the driveway of the recently sold Palmer mansion. Linda Wilkinson wasn't your typical HOA busybody. For nearly a decade, she had ruled Oakridge with an iron clipboard, known for her ruthless enforcement of violations, whether it was unauthorized garden gnomes or trash cans left out 2 minutes past collection time. Her reputation for upholding property values was unquestioned, so when she filed a formal complaint declaring the SUV abandoned, she had no idea she was messing with NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal. And when Shaq showed up at her doorstep, violation notice in hand, he wasn't there to back down. His response would ignite a chain reaction that would shatter Linda's authority, expose the HOA's selective enforcement, and redefine who truly belonged in Oakridge Estates. What began as a petty power trip would become Linda's very public downfall. The residents of Oakridge would never forget the day their most notorious HOA enforcer found herself on the wrong side of the rules. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Linda Wilkinson's heels clicked purposefully on the sidewalk as she completed her self-appointed morning patrol of Oakridge Estates. The neighborhood was waking up around her, sprinklers hissing over manicured lawns, luxury sedans purring down driveways as executives headed to their corner offices. This was order. This was prosperity. This was what she had fought to maintain for nearly a decade as the secretary of the Homeowners Association board. Her phone chimed with a text from her daughter. "Mom, I need $40 for the field trip tomorrow." Linda sighed. Since the divorce 3 years ago, Zoe had grown increasingly distant, treating Linda's home like a hotel and her ex-husband Trevor's new condo like a sanctuary. She'd respond later. Right now, she had duties to attend to. As she rounded the corner onto Magnolia Drive, something jarring disrupted the pristine landscape ahead. A massive black vehicle sat in the driveway of the old Palmer mansion, the A listing that had finally sold last month after sitting empty for over a year. The SUV was clearly customized, oversized wheels, gleaming chrome accents, and dark-tinted windows. Most offensively, it was emblazoned with some sort of logo on the side doors. "Absolutely unacceptable," Linda muttered, quickening her pace. The vehicle had been there for at least 3 days now. She'd noticed it earlier in the week but assumed it belonged to a service worker. Now it appeared the eyesore might actually belong to whoever had purchased the property. Linda stopped at the edge of the driveway, her lips pressed into a thin line as she surveyed the scene. The Palmer mansion was one of Oakridge's crown jewels, a 12,000-square-foot Mediterranean with a 4-car garage that could easily house this monstrosity out of sight. Yet here it sat, violating at least 3 separate HOA regulations by her count. She pulled out her phone and began meticulously photographing the vehicle from various angles, paying special attention to the custom modifications and the logo. This would not stand in Oakridge Estates, not on her watch. "I've called this emergency meeting because we have a situation that requires immediate attention," Linda announced, standing at the head of the conference table in the Oakridge Estates clubhouse. She connected her phone to the projector, and an image of the black SUV filled the wall behind her. Ronald Barker, the HOA president, leaned forward, his silver hair catching the light. "What are we looking at, Linda?" "This vehicle has been abandoned in the driveway of the Palmer property for nearly 4 days now," Linda said, advancing to the next image. "As you can see, it violates our regulations regarding commercial vehicles with this garish logo, and clearly runs afoul of our aesthetic standards with these modifications." "Do we know who purchased the Palmer property?" asked Diane Chen, the newest board member. She was a cardiothoracic surgeon who had moved to Oakridge 5 years ago and had reluctantly joined the board after Linda had orchestrated a campaign to get fresh perspectives. Linda now regretted that decision. "That's irrelevant to the violation," Linda replied curtly. "The fact is, no resident of Oakridge should be displaying a vehicle like this. It's dragging down property values for the entire neighborhood. Diane frowned. Shouldn't we contact the new owner before filing a formal complaint? Perhaps they're in the process of moving in and don't realize. The rules exist for a reason, Diane, Ronald interjected smoothly. If we start making exceptions, where do we draw the line? Linda's right that we need to address this promptly. Linda shot Ronald a grateful look. This was why she appreciated him as president. He understood the importance of maintaining standards. Since her divorce from Trevor and the subsequent social reshuffling that had left her feeling increasingly isolated within the community she'd helped build, these moments of validation had become precious. I've drafted a violation notice, Linda continued, distributing copies around the table. It cites Regulation 7.2 regarding vehicle appearance, 8.3 about commercial displays, and 11.6 concerning eyesores visible from the street. The violation notice was Linda's masterpiece, striking just the right balance between authority and condescension. It informed the recipient that they had 48 hours to remove the offending vehicle before fines would begin accruing at $100 per day. Don't you think the tone is a bit severe? Diane ventured, scanning the document. The neighborhood standards are severe, Diane, Linda replied. That's why we all paid a premium to live here. The meeting continued with discussion of other minor infractions around the neighborhood. The Petersons' trash can left out 12 hours too long. The Goldsteins' unauthorized bird feeder. But Linda remained focused on her primary target. By the end of the hour, the board had voted 4-1 to approve her violation notice, with only Diane dissenting. As Linda gathered her papers, a satisfied smile played across her lips. This was what control felt like. This was respect. Her social invitations might have dwindled since Trevor left her for his 29-year-old paralegal. But here, in the HOA, Linda Wilkinson still wielded power. Unbeknownst to the board members, 16-year-old Zoe Wilkinson had been sitting in the lounge area adjacent to the conference room, earbuds and butt music paused, overhearing every word of her mother's presentation. When the photos of the vehicle appeared on the projector, visible through the glass partition, Zoe had straightened up in recognition. That custom Escalade belonged to Shaquille O'Neal. She was certain of it. She'd seen it featured in a YouTube video just last month. The former NBA star had a collection of customized vehicles, and this one, with its distinctive logo and modifications, was unmistakable. Zoe slumped down in her chair, mortification washing over her. Her mother was about to send a condescending violation notice to one of the most beloved sports figures in America, and knowing her mother, she wouldn't bother to check who owned the property before launching her attack. As the board members filtered out of the conference room, Zoe quickly pretended to be absorbed in her phone. Her mother barely glanced her way. I'll be taking the violation notice over personally this afternoon, Linda informed Ronald as they passed by. I want to make sure it doesn't get lost in the mail, as so many of our notices mysteriously do. Good thinking, Linda. Prompt enforcement is key. Zoe watched them go, a knot forming in her stomach. She should say something, warn her mother about who she was targeting. But years of experience had taught her that Linda Wilkinson didn't listen to anyone once she believed herself to be right, especially not her increasingly difficult teenage daughter. She typed out a text to her father. Mom's about to get herself in serious trouble with the HOA. Then deleted it. Trevor would only use the information as ammunition in his ongoing campaign to secure full custody. Despite everything, some remnant of loyalty kept Zoe from actively contributing to her mother's downfall. Instead, she gathered her things and headed for the door, her mother's voice echoing in her head. The neighborhood standards are severe. But it wasn't the neighborhood standards that worried Zoe. It was her mother's narrowing definition of who belonged within them. That afternoon, Linda Wilkinson stood before her bathroom mirror, applying a fresh coat of coral lipstick. She had changed into a crisp white blouse and navy blazer, her authority outfit as she privately thought of it. The violation notice was tucked into a cream-colored envelope, the Oakridge Estates logo embossed in gold on the front. She studied her reflection. Blonde hair cut in an angled bob that required maintenance every 4 weeks. Skin that benefited From regular treatments at Oakridge's exclusive med spa, the diamond studs Trevor had given her on their 10th anniversary, before everything fell apart. At 52, Linda still turned heads, still commanded attention, still belonged in Oakridge, despite what Trevor's departure had threatened to suggest about her status. "This is for the good of the community," she told her reflection, rehearsing the firm but neighborly tone she would adopt when delivering the notice. "We all agree to certain standards when we move here. No exceptions." Downstairs, she heard the front door open and close, Zoe returning from wherever she'd disappeared to after the board meeting. Their interactions had become a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance lately. Linda tucked the envelope into her purse and descended the stairs, keys in hand. Zoe was in the kitchen, rummaging through the refrigerator. "I'm heading out to deliver a violation notice," Linda announced. "There's a new owner at the Palmer place who needs to understand how things work around here." Zoe closed the refrigerator door slowly. "Mom, do you even know who bought that house?" "That's not relevant to the violation," Linda replied, echoing her response to Diane earlier. "Rules are rules." "But don't you think—" "I don't have time for this, Zoe. I'll be back in an hour. Please unload the dishwasher while I'm gone." As Linda strode to her Mercedes, she felt a familiar surge of righteousness. This was what kept Oakridge special, vigilance against the slow creep of declining standards. If the new owner couldn't respect the community's rules, they could live somewhere else. There were plenty of neighborhoods in the area with more flexible requirements. The violation notice felt substantial in her purse, a tangible expression of her authority. By this time tomorrow, that eyesore would be gone from the Palmer driveway, and Linda Wilkinson would have once again proven her indispensable value to Oakridge Estates. Little did she know, the envelope she carried contained more than a citation. It held the catalyst for her own reckoning, a confrontation that would expose the carefully constructed facade of both Oakridge Estates and Linda herself. The security guard at Oakridge Estates' main gate straightened instantly when he recognized the driver of the Range Rover. "Mr. O'Neal, welcome back, sir," he said, unable to keep the excitement from his voice as he hurriedly raised the gate. Shaquille O'Neal nodded with a warm smile. "Thanks, James. How's that son of yours doing on the court?" The guard beamed. "Growing like a weed, sir, 6 inches taller since last year. You tell him to keep working on that hook shot we talked about." In the back seat, Shaquille's 13-year-old daughter Amira rolled her eyes. "Dad, you literally can't go anywhere without talking basketball." "Not true," he countered, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "Sometimes I talk about Krispy Kreme." His 16-year-old son Sharif laughed. "He's got you there." As they drove through the winding streets of Oakridge, Shaquille felt a familiar mixture of anticipation and wariness. The purchase of the Palmer mansion had been strategic. Its location halfway between his primary residence and his children's mother's home would make shared custody arrangements easier. The prestigious school district was an added bonus, and the gated community offered a buffer against the constant recognition that came with being 7 feet tall and one of the most recognizable athletes in the world. "So, what's the big surprise?" Amira asked, peering out the window at the immaculate homes with their perfect landscaping. "Why are we here?" "Patience," Shaquille replied, turning onto Magnolia Drive. "Almost there." He'd deliberately kept the home purchase quiet, working through a private trust to maintain anonymity during the closing. Even his ex-wife had only been informed last week. While he'd never be able to live in complete anonymity, Shaquille valued what privacy he could maintain. Fame had taught him that first impressions were rarely genuine when people already thought they knew you. The Palmer mansion came into view, its Mediterranean architecture standing proud against the backdrop of mature oak trees that gave the neighborhood its name. Shaquille pulled into the circular driveway, parking behind his customized Escalade that he'd left there earlier in the week when meeting with contractors. "Whose house is this?" Sharif asked, curiosity evident in his voice. Shaquille turned in his seat, watching as comprehension slowly dawned on his children's faces. "No way," Amira whispered, her eyes widening. "Welcome to our new weekend home," Shaquille announced, unable to suppress his grin. What do you think? The teenagers erupted in excitement, questions tumbling over each other as they scrambled out of the car. Shaquille followed at a more measured pace, a deep satisfaction warming his chest. This was why he'd worked so hard all these years, to provide for his family, to create spaces where they could thrive. When can we move in? Sharif asked, already at the front steps. It needs some work first, Shaquille explained, retrieving his keys. The previous owner's taste was a little boring, Amira suggested, peering through one of the front windows. I was going to say formal, Shaquille chuckled, but boring works too. As they approached the front door, Shaquille noticed something attached to it, a cream-colored envelope with gold embossing. He frowned slightly but maintained his smile as he unlocked the door. Go on in and explore, he told his children. The contractor should be here in about 15 minutes to talk about the renovations. Once they had rushed inside, voices echoing in the empty foyer, Shaquille plucked the envelope from the door. The Oakridge Estates logo gleamed expensively on the front. Breaking the seal, he withdrew a formal letter printed on heavy stock paper. As he read, his expression gradually hardened. Violation notice, the heading declared in bold lettering. The letter went on to cite multiple infractions regarding the unauthorized commercial vehicle parked in the driveway, describing his custom Escalade as an eyesore that violated community aesthetic standards. Most tellingly, it referred to the vehicle as abandoned, though it had only been there for 3 days. The notice gave him 48 hours to remove the offending vehicle before daily fines would be imposed, and was signed by one Linda Wilkinson, HOA secretary. Shaquille carefully refolded the letter and slipped it into his pocket just as his contractor's truck pulled into the driveway. Mike Chen, a respected builder who had worked on several of Shaquille's properties, emerged with a portfolio tucked under his arm. He greeted Shaquille with a firm handshake. Excited to see what we can do with this place, Mike said. It's got great bones. Let's talk inside, Shaquille replied, his voice measured. The kids are already mapping out what they want. The next hour, they walked through the mansion discussing removing walls to create more open spaces, converting one wing into a home theater and game room, and updating the dated kitchen. Shaquille was particularly interested in raising door frames and customizing shower heights, modifications he'd made to every home he'd owned since his rookie year. Throughout their tour, Sharif and Amira chimed in with their own requests. A basketball court in the backyard, a swimming pool with a slide, rooms decorated in their favorite colors. Shaquille noted each suggestion carefully. This home was for them as much as for him. As they rounded back to the foyer, Mike flipped through his notes. I can have preliminary designs to you by next week. We're looking at about 3 months of work, barring any surprises. Sounds good. Shaquille nodded, his mind partially elsewhere. Kids, why don't you go check out the backyard? I need to discuss something with Mike. Once they were alone, Shaquille withdrew the violation notice from his pocket and handed it to the contractor. Got this when we arrived. Mike scanned the letter, his eyebrows rising progressively higher. Are you kidding me? You've owned the place for what, 2 weeks? 11 days, Shaquille confirmed, his voice calm but tight. And I've only had the Escalade here for 3. This is ridiculous. Your vehicle isn't abandoned, it's just parked. And it's not a commercial vehicle. The logo is my personal brand. Shaquille reclaimed the letter, studying it once more. But I think we both know what this is really about. Mike shifted uncomfortably. You want me to move the car to the garage? No, Shaquille said after a moment's consideration. I think I need to address this directly. Want me to come with you? I appreciate that, but no. Shaquille folded the letter again. This isn't my first time dealing with this kind of welcome committee. After the contractor left with promises to fast-track the design plans, Shaquille retreated to the empty study. The kids were exploring the grounds, giving him a moment of privacy. He placed a call to his longtime attorney, Andrew Goldman. Shaq, how's the new place? Andrew answered on the second ring. Interesting neighborhood. Shaquille replied dryly, then explained the situation. Andrew's response was immediate. I can have a cease and desist letter there by morning. This is textbook discriminatory enforcement. Hold off on that, Shaquille said, leaning back in the chair that was too small for his frame. I want to handle this my way first. You sure? These HOA types don't respond well to reasonableness. I've dealt with tougher opponents than suburban HOA boards, Shaquille reminded him. Let me try my approach before we bring in the legal team. After hanging up, Shaquille stood at the study window, looking out over the manicured perfection of Oakridge Estates. Throughout his career and post-retirement business ventures, he'd developed a carefully calibrated approach to confrontation, firm but measured, assertive without aggression, authoritative while remaining approachable. It was a balance that hadn't come naturally to a man of his physical presence, but one he'd cultivated out of necessity. This Linda Wilkinson had made assumptions about his vehicle, about who belonged in her neighborhood, about what constituted an eyesore. Now he had a choice to make, let it slide or establish boundaries immediately. The sound of his children's laughter drifted in from the backyard, cementing his decision. This would be their home too, a place where they should feel welcome and accepted. If he didn't address this now, it would only be the beginning. Shaquille checked the signature on the letter again. Linda Wilkinson, HOA secretary. He pulled out his phone and opened a search engine. 10 minutes later, he had her address, less than half a mile away on the same street. He also had a clearer picture of who she was. Photos from community events showed a blonde woman in her early 50s, always impeccably dressed, always at the center of things. Articles in the community newsletter credited her with maintaining Oakridge's high standards through vigilant enforcement of HOA regulations. Shaquille made his decision. He would visit Ms. Wilkinson first thing tomorrow morning, violation notice in hand. Not out of anger, but clarity. Not seeking conflict, but resolution. And perhaps in the process, he would begin to determine whether Oakridge Estates could truly be a home for his family or merely an address. He folded the notice one final time and placed it carefully in his wallet. Tomorrow would set the tone for his family's future in this community. And if there was one thing Shaquille O'Neal understood from years of competition, it was the importance of setting the tone early. Dad, Amira called from the garden, come look at this. We found the perfect spot for the basketball court. Putting thoughts of Linda Wilkinson aside for now, Shaquille headed outside to join his children in planning their future. Tomorrow would come soon enough. The morning sun cast long shadows across Linda Wilkinson's front lawn as she shuffled, downstairs in her silk bathrobe, coffee mug in hand. She hadn't slept well. The violation notice delivery yesterday had been anticlimactic. No one had been home at the Palmer mansion, so she'd simply affixed the envelope to the front door with a sense of dutiful satisfaction that had faded by evening. Now, in the harsh light of morning, small doubts prickled at the edges of her confidence. Perhaps she should have investigated who had purchased the property, but that would have suggested uncertainty, and Linda Wilkinson was nothing if not certain. The doorbell rang, an unexpected intrusion into her morning routine. Linda cinched her robe tighter and peered through the peephole. A tall figure stood on her porch, backlit by the morning sun. She couldn't make out the face, but the posture suggested authority. Assuming it was a package delivery requiring signature, Linda opened the door and found herself looking up and up at one of the largest men she had ever seen in person. For a moment she was speechless, taking in the broad shoulders and imposing height. Then her gaze settled on the cream-colored envelope in his hand, her violation notice. Linda straightened her spine and slipped into her practiced tone of neighborly correction. Good morning. I see you've received our notice. I'm Linda Wilkinson, HOA secretary. She didn't extend her hand. Yes, I have, the man replied, his voice surprisingly measured. I'd like to discuss it with you. Linda automatically glanced past him to the street, relieved to see no sign of the offensive vehicle. I'm glad you're taking this seriously. The vehicle described in the notice clearly violates our community standards. Section 7.2 specifically prohibits oversized vehicles with commercial markings. Does it? The man arched an eyebrow. And what makes you think my vehicle is commercial? The logo, of course, Linda replied, irritation seeping into her voice. She didn't appreciate being questioned on regulations she had personally helped draft. Advertisements aren't permitted in Oakridge. It's not an advertisement. It's my personal brand. Linda sighed, the same sigh she'd perfected over years of explaining simple concepts to difficult people. I understand you may be new to communities of this caliber, but in Oakridge, we maintain certain standards. That's why our property values remain among the highest in the county. Across the street, Diane Chen had emerged from her morning Tai Chi routine to water her immaculate front garden. She casually observed the interaction unfolding on Linda's porch, noting the stiff set of Linda's shoulders and the imposing height of her visitor. Something in the visitor's patient stance made Diane retrieve her phone from her pocket and begin recording under the pretense of checking messages. I'm very familiar with communities of this caliber, the man said, his tone still even but with a new edge of steel beneath it. I'm also familiar with selective enforcement. Linda bristled. I assure you, our enforcement is consistent. Your vehicle stands out because it violates our clearly established guidelines. It stands out, the man agreed, but I'm curious if it's the vehicle that's the real issue here. What exactly are you implying? Linda's voice rose slightly. By now, a few more neighbors had taken notice of the exchange. The Hendersons had slowed their morning power walk to a casual stroll, and Tom Roberts had been trimming the same hedge for an unusually long time. Let me introduce myself properly, the man said, extending a hand that dwarfed Linda's. I'm Shaquille O'Neal. I purchased the Palmer property last month. The name hung in the air between them. Linda's face went through a rapid series of transformations. Disbelief, shocked recognition, and finally, a dawning horror as she realized who she was speaking to. Her hand, halfway extended in automatic response, froze. Shaquille O'Neal, she repeated, her voice suddenly thin. The basketball player. Former NBA player, yes. Current businessman, analyst, and new Oakridge resident. His smile didn't reach his eyes. And owner of the custom Escalade you described as an abandoned eyesore. Linda's mouth opened and closed without sound. The violation notice now felt radioactive in his hand. From her vantage point across the street, Diane Chen continued recording, a small smile playing at the corner of her mouth. 6 months ago, Linda had submitted a formal complaint about Diane's Lunar New Year decorations, citing excessive cultural displays that disrupted neighborhood aesthetic cohesion. Watching Linda's composure fracture was, Diane had to admit, deeply satisfying. There must be some misunderstanding, Linda managed finally, her voice artificially bright. Had I known the vehicle belonged to someone of your profile, I would have approached this differently. And that's exactly the problem, isn't it? Shaquille replied, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. The rules should apply equally to everyone, or to no one. By now, the audience had grown. The Hendersons had abandoned all pretense of walking and stood watching from the sidewalk. Tom Roberts had stepped away from his hedge. 2 cars had slowed as they passed, drivers rubbernecking at the confrontation. Even Linda's next-door neighbor, elderly Mrs. Patel, had emerged onto her porch, leaning heavily on her cane. Of course, Linda stammered, acutely aware of the growing audience. I was simply doing my duty as HOA secretary. The community expects certain standards. And what standards are those exactly? Shaquille asked, his voice still measured, but carrying clearly to the gathered neighbors. Because I'm curious how my vehicle was determined to be abandoned after just 3 days, when the Miller's boat sat in their driveway for 2 weeks last summer, without a citation. Linda flushed. That was different. The Millers had permission for temporary. They didn't, interrupted Mrs. Patel from next door, her Indian accent crisp and precise. I asked Caroline Miller about it directly. No permission was ever requested or granted. Linda shot her neighbor a betrayed look. Mina, this is an HOA matter. An interesting one, Mrs. Patel agreed, her smile deceptively sweet. Please continue explaining to Mr. O'Neal why his vehicle violates standards while others do not. The sound of hurried footsteps drew Linda's attention to Ronald Barker, the HOA president, approaching rapidly from down the street. His silver hair was uncombed, his golf shirt hastily tucked into khaki shorts, a shocking state of disarray for the normally immaculate Ronald. He must have been alerted by one of the neighbors. "Good morning," Ronald called with forced joviality as he joined them at Linda's door. "I see you've met our new resident, Linda." "Yes," Linda replied weakly. "We were just discussing the miscommunication about his vehicle." "Miscommunication," Shaquille repeated, unfolding the violation notice. "Is that what we're calling this?" Ronald's eyes widened as he recognized the document. "Ah, there seems to have been an unfortunate error. Rest assured, Mr. O'Neal, this notice is rescinded immediately." "That's not what I'm asking for," Shaquille replied. "What I want to know is why it was issued in the first place." Ronald shot Linda a pointed look. An overabundance of caution, perhaps. Linda is very dedicated to maintaining community standards. "Selective standards," Shaquille corrected. "My attorney noted at least 7 vehicles currently in Oakridge that violate the same regulations cited in this notice, including your own Range Rover with the dealership logo still on the back, Mr. Barker." Ronald blanched visibly. What I'm hearing," Shaquille continued, his gaze sweeping over the gathered neighbors, "is that standards in Oakridge are flexible depending on who you are, or perhaps what you look like." The accusation hung in the air, unspoken, but unmistakable. Linda felt the weight of the neighbors' stares, the judgment in their eyes. Her carefully cultivated image as Oakridge's guardian was crumbling with each passing second. "That is absolutely not the case," she protested, her voice rising with desperation. "I had no idea who owned the vehicle when I filed the complaint." "And that's precisely the issue," Shaquille replied. "You made assumptions. About the vehicle, about its owner, about who belongs in Oakridge." He gestured to the gathering crowd. "I wonder how many of your neighbors have experienced similar assumptions." Across the street, Diane Chen raised her hand slightly. Phone, still recording. Next door, Mrs. Patel nodded emphatically. Further down the block, the Rodriguezes exchanged knowing glances. "This is becoming ridiculous," Linda snapped, embarrassment fueling a last surge of defensiveness. "I was simply enforcing the rules as they're written." "Then perhaps we need to examine how those rules are applied," Shaquille suggested. "Because from where I stand, it looks like there's one set of standards for some residents and another for the rest." Ronald stepped forward, physical inserting himself into the conversation. "Mr. O'Neal, please accept our sincerest apologies for this misunderstanding. I assure you, Oakridge Estates values all its residents equally." "Does it?" Shaquille asked, mildly, looking at Linda rather than Ronald. Linda felt trapped between Shaquille's steady gaze and the neighbor's attention. The bathrobe she still wore suddenly seemed flimsy and inappropriate, a metaphor for her crumbling authority. Everything was spiraling out of control. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I was just doing my job," she insisted, her voice smaller now. "And I'm just asking for equal treatment," Shaquille replied. "So here's what happens next." He folded the violation notice and tucked it into his pocket. Either the HOA begins enforcing its rules consistently for everyone, or it acknowledges that this was discriminatory enforcement and issues a public apology. Ronald jumped in immediately. "Of course we'll review our enforcement procedures, Mr. O'Neal. There's no need for this to escalate." "The third option," Shaquille continued as if Ronald hadn't spoken, "is that my attorneys file a formal complaint with the State Housing Authority regarding discriminatory HOA practices." He smiled, but his eyes remained serious. "I'd prefer not to take that route, but I will if necessary." Linda's facade finally cracked completely. "You can't be serious. One minor violation notice and you're threatening legal action? This is completely disproportionate." "Is it?" Shaquille asked. Or is it exactly proportionate to years of selective enforcement that has gone unchallenged until now? The question silenced Linda. In the stillness that followed, she became acutely aware of the audience they had attracted. At least 15 neighbors now watched from various vantage points. Most damning of all, she could see Diane Chen's phone, clearly aimed in their direction. "I'll give you 48 hours to decide," Shaquille said, echoing the time frame in the violation notice with deliberate irony. "Equal enforcement or a public apology. After that, my attorneys will proceed accordingly." He turned to address the gathered neighbors directly. "I bought a home in Oakridge because I want what all of you want, a safe, beautiful community for my family. I'm happy to follow the same rules as everyone else, but they must be the same rules, applied the same way to everyone." With a final nod to Linda, whose face had gone from flushed to ashen, Shaquille descended the porch steps. The small crowd parted for him, several neighbors nodding in agreement or even offering words of welcome. Diane Chen lowered her phone as he passed, giving him a small but distinct thumbs up. Ronald immediately began damage control, addressing the neighbors with forced cheer. "Well, this has been an enlightening morning. I think we can all agree that clear communication is essential in any community." But Linda barely heard him. She stood frozen in her doorway, watching as her authority, her position, her carefully cultivated image dissolved before her eyes. The violation notice had been meant to assert her power. Instead, it had exposed its limitations, and worse, its foundations. As Shaquille's tall figure disappeared around the corner, Linda finally retreated into her house, closing the door on the murmuring neighbors and Ronald's increasingly desperate platitudes. She leaned against the closed door, heart pounding with humiliation and a dawning sense that nothing in Oakridge would be quite the same after today. Outside, Diane Chen walked briskly back to her house, phone clutched in her hand. The video she'd captured was clear, compelling, and damning. Her finger hovered over the share button, hesitating only briefly before pressing it. Within minutes, Linda Wilkinson's carefully constructed world would begin to expand far beyond the gates of Oakridge Estates. Diane Chen's thumb hesitated for only a moment before hitting post. The 3-minute video uploaded to her social media accounts with a simple caption: "When HOA power goes too far, NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal confronts selective enforcement in our gated community." She set her phone down on the kitchen counter and poured herself a cup of coffee, expecting perhaps a few dozen likes and comments from friends. What she didn't anticipate was how quickly the video would spread beyond her modest following. Within an hour, her phone began buzzing incessantly with notifications. By lunchtime, the video had been shared thousands of times across multiple platforms. By dinner, it had reached hundreds of thousands of views, been picked up by sports blogs, neighborhood, watchdog sites, and was trending under hashtags like Hokerin and the Shaq attack. Diane watched the view counter climb with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. She believed in accountability, but the speed and scale of the internet's response was dizzying. The video was no longer just documentation, it had become a phenomenon. Linda Wilkinson sat alone in her darkened living room, blinds drawn against the outside world as she scrolled through her phone in horrified fascination. Every refresh brought new comments, new shares, new layers of public humiliation. Classic Karen behavior, thinking she owns the neighborhood. The look on her face when she realized who he was: priceless. This is what happens when you give small people a little power. Worst were the comments that included her full name, her position, photos culled from the Oakridge newsletter and community website, her carefully curated public image, competent, authoritative, indispensable, had been rewritten in a matter of hours. She was now Linda the HOA Karen, her decades of community service reduced to a 3-minute clip of her worst moment. Her phone rang again, with Trevor's name flashing on the screen. She declined the call, again, and tossed the phone onto the couch beside her. He'd called 6 times since noon, each voicemail more irritatingly concerned than the last. A sharp knock at the front door made her flinch. Linda froze, holding her breath until a second knock came, followed by her daughter's voice. "Mom, I know you're in there. Open up." Linda reluctantly dragged herself to the door, checking the peephole to confirm it was just Zoe, before opening it a crack. "I'm not feeling well," she said. "I need some privacy right now." Zoe pushed past her mother into the house, her face a storm of conflicting emotions. "The whole school has seen the video," she said without preamble. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" Linda's lips thinned. "For you? You're worried about your embarrassment right now? Everyone is asking me if my mom is the racist HOA lady from the video." Zoe's voice cracked. "And I don't even know how to answer them because what you did was wrong, but you're still my mom." And she trailed off, tears threatening. Linda sagged against the closed door. "I was just enforcing the rules, Zoe. The same rules everyone agreed to when they moved here." "But that's not true, is it?" Zoe challenged, her teenage defiance breaking through the tears. "Mr. O'Neal was right. You enforce the rules differently depending on who breaks them. That's not... Last summer, when Dad's new girlfriend parked her convertible with the top down for a whole weekend, you didn't say anything. But when Dr. Chen put up Lunar New Year decorations for 3 days, you filed a complaint." Linda flinched at her daughter's unexpected perceptiveness. "It's more complicated than that." "No, it's not," Zoe insisted. "And now everyone knows it." She pulled out her phone and thrust it at her mother. "Look, Dad's on the news." Linda stared at the screen in disbelief. There was Trevor, her ex-husband, standing at the Oakridge gates, perfectly groomed and wearing his most sincere expression as he spoke to a local news reporter. "Have always believed in treating everyone with respect," Trevor was saying, his practiced attorney's voice smooth and reasonable. "The actions taken by the HOA in this instance do not reflect my personal values or the true spirit of our community. I've already reached out to Mr. O'Neal to personally apologize for this unfortunate incident." "You were divorced from Linda Wilkinson 3 years ago," the reporter prompted. "But you still live in Oakridge Estates. What's your relationship with the HOA?" Trevor's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I've always maintained a respectful distance from HOA politics. I believe our community is at its best when we focus on bringing people together rather than enforcing divisions." Linda snatched the phone from Zoe's hand, unable to watch anymore. "He's loving this," she hissed. "He's using my situation to make himself look good." "Your situation?" Zoe echoed incredulously. "Mom, you created this situation." Before Linda could respond, her own phone buzzed with a text from Ronald Barker. "Emergency HOA meeting, 7 p.m. tonight, attendance mandatory. At the O'Neal temporary residence across town, Shaquille sat in conference with his longtime publicist, Joanna Martinez, and his attorney, Andrew Goldman. The renovation contractor had been instructed to delay work on the Palmer mansion until further notice. The video has over 500,000 views, Joanna reported, scrolling through analytics on her tablet. It's being covered by everything from ESPN to Good Morning America. We've had 28 interview requests since noon. And we're declining all of them, Shaquille said firmly. "Are you sure about that?" Andrew asked. "This gives you significant leverage with the HOA. A statement could strengthen our position." Shaquille shook his head. "This isn't about leverage or public pressure, it's about doing the right thing the right way." He leaned forward in his chair, which creaked under his weight. "The video says everything that needs to be said," adding, "More fuel now would just turn it into a media circus, and that's not what I want for my kids or for that community." "Speaking of which," Andrew continued, "Ronald Barker has called 4 times. He's practically begging for a meeting." "Let him sweat for another day," Shaquille decided. "I meant what I said about the 48 hours. They need time to think about their next steps, not just react out of panic." Joanna looked up from her tablet. "You sure about this approach? The court of public opinion is solidly on your side right now." "I'm not interested in winning a PR battle," Shaquille replied. "I want structural change. That only happens when people have the space to reflect on their actions, not when they're backed into a corner." His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mr. O'Neal, this is Zoe Wilkinson, Linda's daughter. I just wanted to say I'm sorry about what happened. Not everyone in Oakridge thinks like my mom." Shaquille's expression softened as he read the message. "The daughter," he explained to his team, "sounds like she's caught in the middle of this." Tough position for a kid, Joanna acknowledged. That's why we handle this carefully, Shaquille said. There are real people behind these hashtags, including a 16-year-old girl who didn't ask for any of this. The emergency HOA meeting at the Oakridge clubhouse had the atmosphere of a war room. Ronald Barker stood at the head of the conference table, his usual composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. Linda sat rigidly in her secretary's chair, aware of the sidelong glances from other board members. Diane Chen sat directly across from her, her expression impassive. This situation has escalated beyond anything we could have anticipated, Ronald began, his voice tight. There are 3 news vans at the front gate. Our community is trending on social media for all the wrong reasons, and Mr. O'Neal's attorneys have made it clear that formal legal action remains on the table, which would open us to discovery, added Garrett Wilson, the HOA treasurer. They could request records of every violation notice issued in the past 5 years, every complaint, every board discussion, everything. A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications sank in. I've drafted a statement, Ronald continued, sliding copies across the table. It offers Mr. O'Neal our sincere apologies, rescinds the violation notice, and extends him a special exemption from certain HOA regulations in recognition of his celebrity status and the unique security concerns that entails. Diane Chen picked up the statement, read it, and set it down with deliberate calm. This misses the entire point, she said. Offering Shaquille O'Neal special treatment doesn't address the underlying issue of selective enforcement. We don't have time for a philosophical debate about enforcement, Ronald snapped. We need to contain this PR nightmare before it affects property values. That's all you care about? Diane challenged. Property values? Not the fact that our enforcement practices have systematically targeted certain residents while ignoring violations by others? That's a serious accusation, Diane, Garrett warned. Is it? Diane pulled a folder from her bag and placed it on the table. I've compiled a list of every violation notice issued in the past 2 years, cross-referenced, with property records. Residents with non-Anglo names receive violation notices at 3 times the rate of other homeowners. Newer residents are cited more frequently than established ones. And certain violations, like Linda's ex-husband's girlfriend's car with the top down for a weekend, are mysteriously overlooked. Linda's head snapped up. How did you get access to those records? They're not secret, Linda. They're in the HOA archive, which any board member can review. Diane opened the folder. But more importantly, they tell a story about who gets scrutiny in Oakridge and who gets a pass. Other board members shifted uncomfortably. Meena Patel, who had joined the meeting despite not being on the board, nodded vigorously from her observer seat. This is exactly the kind of internal dispute we cannot afford right now, Ronald insisted. We need to present a united front. What we need, Diane countered, is to acknowledge the problem and commit to meaningful change, not just for Mr. O'Neal but for every resident. I agree with Diane, said Alan Rodriguez, who had been silent until now. As the newest board member, he typically deferred to the others, but tonight his voice was firm. My family has received 3 violation notices in the 2 years we've lived here. My next-door neighbor, who's lived here for 15 years, has a boat in his side yard that violates the same ordinance I was cited for when my mother visited and parked her RV in my driveway for one night. The room fell silent again, tension mounting as the board members looked to Ronald for a response. But it was Linda who spoke next, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't about his race. All eyes turned to her. It wasn't, she insisted, more forcefully. It was about the vehicle. It was out of place. It didn't belong. And who decides what belongs in Oakridge? Diane asked quietly. That's the real question here. Before Linda could respond, the clubhouse door burst open and Trevor Wilkinson strode in, still in the suit he'd worn for his news interview. Sorry I'm late, he announced, pulling up a chair without invitation. I thought the board could use some crisis management expertise. Linda stared at her ex-husband in disbelief. You're not on the board, you have no place here. I think we can all agree this situation requires all hands on deck, Trevor replied smoothly. I've already spoken with several media outlets to help control the narrative. Control the, Linda sputtered. You threw me under the bus on local television. I created distance between your actions and the community, Trevor corrected. It's called damage control. No one asked you to speak for Oakridge, Linda shot back. Someone had to, Trevor replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. And since our daughter is being affected by your actions, I have every right to mitigate the fallout. Linda recoiled, as if slapped. The mention of Zoe was a deliberate twist of the knife, a reminder of what was at stake in their ongoing custody arrangement. Ronald cleared his throat. While we appreciate your concern, Trevor, this is an official board meeting. Fine, Trevor stood. But you should know I've scheduled a meeting with Mr. O'Neal tomorrow. Since we have mutual connections through my firm's sports division, I thought a personal touch might help smooth things over. Linda watched her ex-husband saunter out, confident and untouchable. He had always been skilled at positioning himself, advantageously at making himself the hero of every story, and now he was using her humiliation to elevate himself, with their daughter, with the community, and apparently with Shaquille O'Neal. After Trevor's departure, the meeting continued with increasing friction. Diane and Alan pushed for comprehensive review of all HOA practices, while Ronald desperately tried to focus on immediate damage control. Linda remained largely silent, her thoughts spinning between rage, humiliation, and an unfamiliar sense of doubt. By the time the meeting concluded at nearly midnight, they had managed only to agree that Ronald would request a direct meeting with Shaquille to present a formal apology. The deeper issues remained unresolved, fault lines exposed in what had once seemed a unified community. As the board members filed out of the clubhouse, Linda lingered, gathering her papers with shaking hands. Diane paused in the doorway watching, her former friend with a complicated expression. It's not too late to do the right thing, Linda, she said quietly. Linda didn't look up. What would you know about it? You've been on the board for less than a year. I know what it's like to be treated as an outsider in my own community, Diane replied. To have people look at my name, my face, my customs, and decide I don't quite belong. This isn't about belonging, Linda insisted. Isn't it? Diane asked. Then what is it about? Linda had no answer. She continued gathering her papers in silence until Diane sighed and left her alone in the empty clubhouse, surrounded by the wreckage of her carefully constructed world. Outside, the news vans remained parked by the Oakridge gates, their lights visible from the clubhouse windows. Inside those gates, hundreds of residents were watching the viral video, forwarding it to friends, discussing it in group chats and over hastily arranged drinks. Linda Wilkinson's name and face were now known far beyond the confines of her community, attached to a moment she couldn't take back. As she finally left the clubhouse, Linda's phone buzzed with a social media notification. Someone had tagged her in yet another comment thread. Despite her better judgment, she opened it and found herself looking at side-by-side images. Her confrontation with Shaquille that morning next to a photo from 3 years earlier. In that older image, she stood proudly beside Trevor at the Oakridge charity gala, both of them smiling, successful, admired. The caption read simply, "How it started versus how it's going." Linda turned off her phone and walked to her car alone, the weight of public judgment pressing down on her with each step. For the first time in years, she found herself questioning, not just her actions, but the assumptions that had guided them, and the community that had reinforced them for so long. A week after the confrontation, Linda Wilkinson's once immaculate home had begun to show signs of neglect. Mail piled up on the entryway table. Unwashed coffee mugs cluttered the kitchen counter and the blinds remained perpetually drawn. Linda herself had barely ventured outside except for one disastrous trip to the grocery store 3 days ago, where whispers and stares had followed her down every aisle until she'd abandoned her half-filled cart and fled. She sat now in her darkened living room, scrolling through the neighborhood's private social media group on her tablet. She had been removed as an administrator but remained a member, though she suspected that was an oversight rather than mercy. Community Town. Hall meeting, the latest post announced. Saturday, 7 p.m. at the Oakridge Clubhouse. Topic: HOA Reform and Community Standards. All residents encouraged to attend. The post had been created by Diane Chen, with Ronald Barker conspicuously co-signing as HOA president. Linda scrolled through the comments, each one a fresh wound to her pride. Looking forward to a more inclusive and fair approach to our community standards, it's about time we discuss these issues openly. Will there be specific proposals to address selective enforcement? Linda tossed the tablet aside, a familiar wave of defensive anger rising in her chest. None of them understood what she'd been trying to do all these years: maintain the standards that kept Oakridge special, that protected their investments, that preserved the community they'd all bought into. But beneath the anger, a newer, more uncomfortable emotion had begun to take root. Doubt. In the enforced solitude of the past week, memories had surfaced unbidden, moments that seemed inconsequential at the time but now carried the weight of pattern. The violation notice she'd issued to the Rodriguezes for their children's basketball hoop, visible from the street, while ignoring the Andersons' golf putting green that violated the same ordinance. The persistent complaints about the cooking odors from Mrs. Patel's home, but never about the Johnsons' weekend barbecues that filled the neighborhood with smoke. The stern warning to Dr. Chen about her Lunar New Year decorations, while Christmas lights were permitted to stay up weeks past the holiday. Each memory brought a tiny fissure to the wall of righteousness Linda had built around herself. But admitting these inconsistencies meant confronting questions about her motivations that she wasn't ready to face. The doorbell rang, startling her from her thoughts. Through the security camera feed on her phone, she saw Zoe standing on the porch, a backpack slung over one shoulder. Linda hesitated, then reluctantly went to open the door. Zoe didn't wait for an invitation, brushing past her mother into the house. "Your yard looks terrible," she said by way of greeting. "When was the last time you watered anything?" Linda closed the door, stung by the criticism but unwilling to admit she'd been afraid to face even her own front yard. "I didn't know you were coming back. I thought you were staying with your father until things settled down. Dad's being impossible," Zoe replied, dropping her backpack on the floor. "He's using this whole situation to build his personal brand as some kind of progressive champion. It's gross." Despite everything, Linda felt a flicker of vindication. He always was good at turning any situation to his advantage. "Like you're any different," Zoe shot back, her momentary alliance with her mother evaporating. "You've been using the HOA as your personal power trip for years." Linda flinched. "That's not fair. I was upholding community standards that everyone agreed to." "No, you were enforcing your idea of what Oakridge should be," Zoe countered, pulling out her phone. "And I've got receipts." She thrust the phone at Linda, who reluctantly took it. On the screen was a screenshot of an email Linda had sent to the board 2 years ago, discussing a potential buyer for the Mendoza property. "While I understand the offer is above asking price, I have concerns about whether this buyer would be a good fit for our community culture. The Oakridge lifestyle requires a certain understanding of decorum and standards that may not align with their background." Linda remembered writing those words about a wealthy music producer who had toured the property. She had never met him, had known nothing about him except that he was young, black, and worked in the hip-hop industry. "How did you get this?" she asked, her voice hollow. "It's all over Twitter," Zoe replied. "Someone leaked a bunch of old HOA emails. There's more." She swiped to the next screenshot, Linda questioning whether the Chen family's home-based medical practice would bring undesirable traffic to the neighborhood, though Dr. Chen only saw patients at the hospital. Another swipe revealed Linda's opposition to a proposed playground in the community park, because it might attract outside elements to Oakridge. "Do you see a pattern?" Zoe asked, her voice quieter now but no less intense. Linda handed the phone back, her hands trembling slightly. "You're taking these out of context. I was concerned about property values, about maintaining the community we all invested in." "But who gets to be part of that community?" Zoe pressed. "Who belongs in your version of Oakridge?" The question hung in the air between them, uncomfortably pointed. Linda turned away, unable to meet her daughter's searching gaze. "I never thought of myself as prejudiced," she said finally, the words tasting foreign on her tongue. I just wanted to protect what we had built. By keeping out people who looked or sounded different, Zoe finished for her. That's literally the definition of prejudice, Mom. Linda sank onto the couch, suddenly exhausted. When did you get so wise? She asked, a hint of bitterness in her voice. You're 16. You don't understand how the world works. Maybe I understand better than you think, Zoe replied, sitting on the opposite end of the couch. My generation doesn't see difference the way yours does. My friend group includes people you would have tried to keep out of Oakridge. Linda wanted to deny it, to defend herself against her daughter's accusation, but the evidence on Zoe's phone, her own words, made that impossible. Instead, she asked the question that had been haunting her since the confrontation with Shaquille O'Neal. Do you think I'm a bad person? Zoe considered the question with surprising seriousness. No, she said finally. I think you're a person who did something bad. There's a difference. Does that difference matter to anyone else? Linda asked, gesturing vaguely toward the window, toward the community that had turned against her. It could, Zoe said, if you actually acknowledged what you did wrong and tried to make it right. She paused, then added quietly, Dad's not going to. He's too busy using this to boost his image. Linda's laugh was hollow. Of course he is. Your father has always been exceptionally skilled at landing on his feet. He's a total hypocrite, Zoe agreed, a rare moment of alignment between mother and daughter.
He acted the same way you did about the Chens moving in, but now he's on TV talking about inclusion. Linda looked at her daughter with new eyes, recognizing the emerging adult behind the teenage facade. When did you start seeing through him?
When he left, Zoe replied simply. When I realized how much of his perfect dad routine was just for show. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past and their complicated family dynamics settling between them. There's a community meeting on Saturday, Linda said finally. About HOA reform. I know. Diane texted me about it. Linda raised an eyebrow. You're in touch with Diane Chen? She checks on me sometimes, Zoe explained. She understands what it's like to be caught in the middle of this. Another silence fell, broken only by the distant sound of a lawnmower outside. Normal life, continuing beyond Linda's self-imposed isolation. Are you going to the meeting? Zoe asked. Linda hadn't planned to. The thought of facing the community, of standing before neighbors who had seen her humiliation and read her damning emails, made her physically ill. But now, looking at her daughter, who had come back despite everything, who still believed she could be better than her worst moments, Linda found herself reconsidering. Maybe, she said noncommittally. I haven't decided. Zoe nodded, seeming to understand the enormity of what she was asking. I think you should, she said, rising from the couch, but I'm going either way. She picked up her backpack and headed for the stairs, then paused and turned back. Oh, and Mom, the next time you decide someone doesn't belong somewhere, remember that might be what people are thinking about you now. As her daughter's footsteps receded upstairs, Linda remained motionless on the couch, Zoe's parting words echoing in her mind. For the first time, she truly understood what it felt like to be judged and found wanting, to be deemed an undesirable. Presence in spaces once considered safe. The irony was not lost on her, though its lesson was still taking shape in her heart. In his spacious hotel suite across town, Shaquille O'Neal was having a conversation of his own with his 16-year-old son, Sharif. The younger O'Neal sat across from his father, his lanky frame slumped in an armchair as he scrolled through his phone. It's everywhere, Dad, he reported. People are calling you a hero for standing up to her. Shaquille's expression remained neutral. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was just setting boundaries. Well, the internet loves it, Sharif replied. There are memes and everything. That's exactly what I was hoping to avoid. Shaquille sighed, leaning back in his chair, which creaked under his substantial frame. This was supposed to be about addressing a specific issue in our new community, not becoming a viral moment. Sharif looked up from his phone. But doesn't it help? Now they have to do something about it. Public pressure can force actions, but it doesn't always change hearts, Shaquille explained. Real change happens when people make different choices, because they understand why their old choices were wrong, not because they're afraid of being the next viral video. Sharif considered this, his youthful face serious beyond his years. So, what are you going to do? The HOA president keeps calling. I know, and I'll meet with him tomorrow, Shaquille replied. But first, I want to hear your thoughts on something. When you saw that violation notice on our door, how did it make you feel? Sharif looked surprised by the question. I didn't really think about it. I figured it was just some boring neighborhood rule thing. And if I told you it was because of who we are, not what we did, the teenager's expression darkened. That would be messed up. It is messed up, Shaquille agreed. And it happens all the time, in ways big and small. The question is how we respond. Sharif shifted uncomfortably. Is this going to be one of your teaching moments? Shaquille smiled, recognizing his son's defensive deflection. Maybe, but it's also a real question I'm wrestling with. Because how I handle this doesn't just affect me, it affects you, your sister, and potentially this whole community. The sincerity in his father's tone seemed to reach Sharif, who set his phone down and straightened up. So what are the options? I could pursue legal action, Shaquille explained. We'd probably win, there'd be a settlement, some policy changes on paper. Or I could try to foster actual dialogue and understanding, which is messier and less certain but might lead to real transformation. What's the point of talking to people who already showed what they think of us? Sharif challenged. It was a fair question, and Shaquille took his time answering. Because people can change when they're given the space to reflect and grow. Not everyone, not always, but it happens, I've seen it. Did you always think that way? Sharif asked skeptically. No, Shaquille admitted with a small laugh. I was a lot less patient when I was your age, but I've learned that sometimes the most powerful response to disrespect isn't force, it's dignity. That sounds like something Grandma would say, Sharif observed. Where do you think I learned it? Shaquille countered. Your grandmother taught me that demanding respect starts with conducting yourself in a way that commands it. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, father and son each contemplating the legacy of wisdom that connected them. There's a community meeting on Saturday, Shaquille said finally. About HOA reform, I'm thinking of attending. Sharif's eyebrows shot up. You're going to walk into a room full of people who've been watching you get attacked by their HOA? I'm going to walk into a room full of neighbors, Shaquille corrected gently, some of whom might be ready to have an honest conversation about making their community more welcoming. And what about the Linda lady? Sharif asked. You think she'll be there? I don't know, Shaquille replied truthfully. That's her choice to make. Sharif studied his father's calm expression. You're really not angry about any of this, are you? I was at first, Shaquille admitted, but anger doesn't serve me or our family now. What serves us is clarity about who we are and what we stand for. His phone buzzed with a text from Diane Chen. Community meeting confirmed for Saturday, 7 p.m. Ronald reluctantly on board. Would your presence help or hurt? Shaquille considered the question, aware of his son watching him. After a moment, he typed his response. I'll be there. This isn't about taking sides. It's about finding a way forward. As he set down his phone, he caught Sharif's questioning. Look, I've made my decision, he explained. Sometimes you have to show up in difficult spaces if you want to see change. Sharif nodded slowly, absorbing his father's lesson. So all those times you talked about standing your ground but being bigger than the fight, you meant it literally. Shaquille laughed, the tension of the moment breaking. Something like that. Now, how about we go pick up your sister and get some dinner? I need a break from thinking about HOA politics. As they prepared to leave, Shaquille's attorney called, with an update. Trevor Wilkinson had been attempting to reach Shaquille through various channels, presenting himself as a mediator in the situation. He's positioning himself as the reasonable voice of Oakridge, Andrew reported. clearly trying to distance himself from his ex-wife's actions. Interesting timing on his part, Shaquille observed, unsurprised. Decline any meeting requests? From him. If he's serious about positive change, he can demonstrate that at the community meeting on Saturday like everyone else. After ending the call, Shaquille found Sharif watching him with newfound respect. That was Trevor Wilkinson trying to score points. Sounds that way. Sharif shook his head. And you just shut him down. Some people want to be part of the solution, Shaquille explained as they headed for the door. Others just want to look like they are. The difference becomes clear pretty quickly. As they left the hotel room, father and son walked shoulder to shoulder, Shaquille adjusting his stride to match his son's, a small but meaningful accommodation that symbolized the careful balance he was trying to strike in this situation. Standing, firm while creating space for growth, demanding respect while extending dignity, and above all, modeling for his children how to navigate a world that would not always welcome them with open arms. That same evening, Diane Chen sat at her dinings, room table surrounded by documents, her laptop open to a half-written agenda for Saturday's meeting. What had begun as a simple community discussion had evolved into something more significant, with residents from across Oakridge reaching out to share their own experiences with the HOA. The doorbell rang, and Diane was surprised to find Meena Patel on her doorstep, a folder clutched in her weathered hands. "I hope I'm not disturbing your dinner," the elderly woman said, her voice still carrying the lilt of her native Mumbai despite decades in America. "Not at all, please come in," Diane welcomed her. "I was just working on the agenda for Saturday." Mrs. Patel settled at the dining table and opened her folder. "I've been keeping records," she explained, spreading out meticulously documented pages. "Every violation notice, every denied request, every comment at meetings. 7 years' worth." Diane stared at the careful documentation. "This is comprehensive. When you've lived as long as I have, you learn to keep receipts," Mrs. Patel said with a small smile. "Especially when patterns emerge." Together, they reviewed the evidence. A clear picture of systematic bias in the HOA's enforcement actions, with certain residents receiving disproportionate scrutiny, while others enjoyed silent exemptions. "Have you shared this with anyone before?" Diane asked. Mrs. Patel shook her head. "What would be the point? Linda and Ronald controlled the board, and I didn't want to be seen as difficult." Her smile turned wry. "More difficult than they already found me, that is." "Thank you for bringing this forward now," Diane said, genuine appreciation in her voice. "This will help ensure our discussion on Saturday addresses the real issues, not just the recent incident." "The recent incident was merely the match," Mrs. Patel observed. "The kindling has been gathering for years." As they continued to organize the evidence, Diane's phone chimed with a text from an unexpected source, Linda Wilkinson. "Is it too late to request a space to speak at Saturday's meeting?" Diane stared at the message in surprise, then showed it to Mrs. Patel, who raised her eyebrows. "Well," the older woman said after a moment's consideration, "that is unexpected." "Do you think she's sincere?" Diane asked. Mrs. Patel considered the question carefully. "Sincerity can only be judged by actions, not words. But people deserve the chance to demonstrate it." Diane nodded and typed her reply. "The meeting is open to all residents. You'll have the same opportunity to speak as everyone else." She hesitated, then added, "It takes courage to show up in a difficult situation. Whatever you decide, I acknowledge that." After sending the message, Diane returned to the documentation. Before her, the pattern of small injustices that had accumulated over years into a community governed by unspoken hierarchies and selective standards. Saturday's meeting would be the first step toward addressing these deeper issues, beyond the viral moment that had catalyzed this reckoning. As Mrs. Patel prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "in all my years in Oakridge, this is the first time I've felt like we might become a true community rather than just houses behind the same gate." Diane smiled, touched by the observation. "That's exactly what I'm hoping for." After Mrs. Patel left, Diane added one final item to the meeting agenda. Community standards. Who decides what belongs? It was the question at the heart of everything. The question Linda had been forced to confront. The question Shaquille had posed on her doorstep. The question that would determine whether Oakridge Estates could evolve beyond its carefully manicured surface to become a place where people, not just properties, were valued. As the various residents of Oakridge prepared for bed that night, Linda in her quiet house with Zoe upstairs, Shaquille in his hotel room thinking of the home he hoped to create, Diane at her table with the evidence of years of silent struggle, Ronald fretting over potential lawsuits and Trevor plotting his next advantageous move, the community stood at a crossroads. Saturday's meeting would be more than a discussion about HOA policies. It would be a referendum on what kind of neighborhood they wanted to be. And for Linda Wilkinson, it would be the moment that defined whether she could find a path forward from her greatest public failure, whether she could acknowledge the harm her actions had caused and begin the difficult work of becoming someone different, someone better than the person who had stood on her porch a week ago, certain of her authority and blind to her prejudice. By 6:45 p.m. on Saturday, the Oakridge Estates clubhouse was already approaching capacity. Residents who typically skipped HOA meetings had arrived early to secure seats, the parking lot filled with luxury vehicles spilling into overflow areas. Inside, the usual arrangement of 30 chairs had been supplemented with an additional 50, borrowed from the pool area and fitness center. Diane Chen stood near the entrance, greeting residents with clipboard in hand, the calm in her expression belying her inner tension. This wasn't just another community gathering, it was potentially a turning point for Oakridge. Quite the turnout, observed Meena Patel, who had positioned herself beside Diane. I don't think I've seen this many neighbors in one place since the 10-year anniversary gala. And that had an open bar, Diane replied with a small smile. She checked her watch, then scanned the room. The divisions were immediately apparent. Long-term residents clustered near the front. Newer homeowners and those from more diverse backgrounds gathered toward the back and sides. Ronald Barker stood near the podium, reviewing his notes with increasing agitation as he observed the growing crowd. At precisely 7:00 p.m., Diane moved to the podium, tapping the microphone to signal the start of the meeting. The room gradually quieted, all eyes turning toward her. "Good evening, neighbors," she began, her surgeon's composure serving her well. "Thank you for coming tonight. As you know, our community has experienced some challenging events recently." A murmur of acknowledgement rippled through the audience. "This meeting is not about assigning blame," Diane continued. "It's about addressing underlying issues that have affected many residents for years and determining how we move forward as a truly inclusive community." Ronald stepped forward, clearly eager to take control of the narrative. Diane smoothly yielded the microphone, though not without a meaningful glance at Mrs. Patel, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Thank you, Diane," Ronald began, adjusting his tie. "As HOA president, I want to assure everyone that the board takes these concerns seriously. We've already drafted revisions to our enforcement procedures to ensure greater consistency and fairness." He brandished a document from his jacket pocket. "This new protocol will require documentation of all alleged violations with photographic evidence, peer review before issuing notices, and quarterly audits of enforcement patterns." From the middle of the room, Alan Rodriguez raised his hand. "And who will conduct these audits?" "The same board that's been selectively enforcing rules for years." Ronald's smile tightened. "We're proposing a rotating committee of residents to provide oversight." "Handpicked by the current board, I assume?" Alan pressed. Before Ronald could respond, the clubhouse doors opened, and a ripple of whispers spread through the room as Shaquille O'Neal entered. Despite his celebrity status, he was dressed simply, in dark jeans and a navy blazer. He nodded politely to Diane before taking a seat in the back row, acknowledging greetings from several residents but maintaining a respectful distance from the proceedings. Ronald faltered momentarily, his prepared remark suddenly inadequate for the gravity of the moment. "Mr. O'Neal, we weren't sure if you'd be joining us tonight. On behalf of the HOA, I want to extend, perhaps we should follow the agenda," Diane interjected gently but firmly, reclaiming the microphone. "We have many residents who wish to speak tonight." Ronald reluctantly stepped back, his authority visibly diminished by Diane's quiet confidence and Shaquille's dignified presence. "Our first agenda item," Diane continued, "is to hear from community members about their experiences with HOA enforcement. We ask that everyone speak respectfully and focus on systemic issues rather than personal attacks." For the next 30 minutes, a succession of residents approached the microphone. Their stories formed a pattern that became increasingly impossible to ignore. Sophia Morales described receiving violation notices for her children's bicycles visible in her driveway, while her neighbor's golf cart had been parked in the same location for months without citation. Dr. Gupta detailed the extensive scrutiny his landscaping plans had received, requiring multiple revisions and board approvals, while similar projects by longer-term residents had been approved without question. The Washingtons recounted how their application to add a small religious symbol to their mailbox had been denied for aesthetic reasons, though seasonal decorations of other faiths were routinely permitted. With each testimony, the temperature in the room rose. Ronald's posture became increasingly defensive, while several long-term board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Notably absent was Linda Wilkinson, whose empty chair in the front row seemed to speak volumes about her unwillingness to face the community. "These are isolated incidents being presented without context," Ronald attempted when there was finally a pause in the testimonies. "The board has always—" "With respect, Mr. Barker," interrupted Mrs. Patel, rising slowly from her seat with the assistance of her cane. "There is extensive documentation suggesting otherwise." She nodded to Diane, who distributed copies of a meticulously organized report. "This analysis shows that over the past 5 years, homeowners with non-Anglo surnames received violation notices at a rate 3 times higher than other residents. Properties owned by non-white residents were subject to an average of 2.7 more inspections per year than those owned by white residents." Ronald sputtered. "These statistics are misleading. There are numerous factors that—" "The data speaks for itself," Mrs. Patel replied calmly. "And it tells a story of who is scrutinized in Oakridge and who is not, who is presumed to belong and who must constantly prove their belonging." The clubhouse doors opened again, drawing all eyes. Linda Wilkinson stood in the doorway, pale but composed, with Zoe slightly behind her. She wore a simple black dress, her usual impeccable makeup subdued, her expression a mix of anxiety and determination. A hush fell over the room as Linda made her way to a vacant seat in the middle section, neither hiding at the back nor claiming her usual place at the front. Zoe sat beside her, shoulders straight, chin lifted in quiet defiance of the stares directed at her mother. Ronald seized the momentary distraction. "As I was saying, the board has already taken steps to address—" "Excuse me." A new voice entered the conversation as Trevor Wilkinson rose from his seat near the front. His tailored suit and practiced smile were familiar to everyone from his recent media appearances. As a longtime resident and someone who's been deeply troubled by recent events, I'd like to offer some perspective. He moved toward the podium with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "While I'm no longer associated with the actions of certain individuals," he began, with a pointed glance toward Linda, "I believe our community needs healing rather than division. Perhaps we could establish a reconciliation committee, which I would be honored to chair." "Sit down, Trevor." Linda's voice, though not loud, cut through the room with surprising authority. Trevor turned, his practiced smile faltering. "Linda, I'm simply trying to help move us forward in a positive—" "No, you're not," Linda replied, rising from her seat. "You're trying to position yourself advantageously, as you always do." Trevor's expression hardened. "I think the community deserves voices of reason right now, not the same people who created this situation." "Dad, stop," Zoe interjected, standing beside her mother. "Everyone can see what you're doing." Trevor's composure cracked slightly at his daughter's public rebuke. "Zoe, this is a community matter that adults need to—" "I'm part of this community too," Zoe countered, her voice steady despite a slight tremor in her hands. And I'm tired of people using what happened for their own agenda, including you." A murmur of approval rippled through the younger residents. Trevor, recognizing the shifting tide, retreated to his seat with as much dignity as he could muster. Diane seized the opportunity to redirect the meeting. "I think we've heard enough testimonies to recognize there's a pattern that needs addressing. What we need now are constructive solutions." For the next hour, the community engaged in a surprisingly substantive discussion about HOA reform. Proposals emerged for more diverse board representation, transparent enforcement procedures, and regular community reviews of HOA policies. Throughout, Shaquille remained largely silent, observing the proceedings with thoughtful attention. As the meeting appeared to be winding down, Linda Wilkinson raised her hand. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward the woman who had become the reluctant symbol of everything this meeting was addressing. Diane hesitated only briefly before nodding. "The floor is yours, Linda." Linda made her way to the podium, her steps measured, her shoulders squared against the weight of collective judgment. Standing before her neighbors, many of whom had seen the viral video, read her emails, or experienced her selective enforcement firsthand, she took a deep breath. "I'd like to address the community directly," she began, her voice quiet but clear. "And specifically, I'd like to address Mr. O'Neal if he's willing to hear me." At the back of the room, Shaquille nodded once, his expression neutral but attentive. Linda gripped the edges of the podium, her knuckles white with tension. The room held its collective breath, waiting to see whether this would be a genuine moment of accountability or merely a performance of remorse. "I've spent the past week telling myself that my actions were about maintaining community standards," Linda began. "That I was simply doing my job as HOA secretary. That anyone who followed the rules had nothing to worry about." She paused, visibly struggling with what came next. "But the truth I've been forced to confront, is that I applied those standards unequally. I scrutinized some residents more harshly than others. I made assumptions about who belonged in Oakridge and who didn't, and in doing so, I betrayed the very community I claimed to be protecting." A heavy silence filled the clubhouse as Linda's words settled over the gathered residents. She continued, her voice growing steadier. "To Mr. O'Neal, I judged you and your property based on assumptions that had nothing to do with actual violations and everything to do with my own preconceptions. That was wrong, and I am deeply sorry." She turned slightly, addressing the wider room now. "To my neighbors who have experienced similar treatment from me or the board I've influenced, I apologize. I can't undo the hurt or inconvenience I've caused, but I can acknowledge it and commit to doing better." From the back of the room, Shaquille's deep voice carried without effort, "Thank you for your apology, Ms. Wilkinson. May I ask what prompted this reflection?" Linda's gaze met his across the crowded room. "Honestly, being on the receiving end of the same judgment I've been so quick to pass on others." She gestured toward the assembled residents. "For the first time, I know what it feels like to be deemed unsuitable, to have people look at me and decide I don't belong in spaces where I once felt secure." There was no self-pity in her tone, only recognition. "It's not a comfortable feeling, and I've been causing it for years." Shaquille nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Empathy is a powerful teacher." "It shouldn't have taken this public reckoning for me to develop it," Linda acknowledged. "But here we are." She turned back to address the room at large. "I've submitted my resignation from the HOA board, effective immediately. That's not meant to avoid accountability, but to make space for new leadership that better reflects our diverse community." Ronald Barker shifted uncomfortably at this announcement, which was clearly news to him. Before he could interject, Linda continued, "I also want to be part of the solution, if the community will allow it. Not in a leadership position, but as someone committed to learning and growing. The reforms being discussed tonight are necessary and overdue." As Linda stepped away from the podium, the clubhouse remained silent for a long moment. Then, from the middle of the room, Mrs. Patel's voice rose clear and measured. "Acknowledgement is the beginning of change, not its completion," she observed. "But it is a necessary beginning." Several residents nodded in agreement. Not approval, not absolution, but recognition of a step in the right direction. Diane returned to the podium, sensing the meeting had reached a natural inflection point. I think we've covered significant ground tonight. I propose we form a committee to draft revised HOA guidelines based on tonight's discussion, with representatives from all segments of our community. Hands rose throughout the room, longtime residents and newcomers, those who had spoken and those who had remained silent until now. The energy had shifted from tension to tentative possibility. As the meeting adjourned and residents began to gather in small groups, continuing discussions that had been suppressed for too long, Shaquille made his way toward Linda, who stood, somewhat apart from the clusters of conversation. Those nearby fell silent, watching the interaction with undisguised interest. "Ms. Wilkinson," Shaquille said, extending his hand, "thank you for your words tonight." Linda accepted the handshake, visibly moved by the simple gesture of respect. "Thank you for giving me the chance to offer them. Many wouldn't have." "Growth requires space," Shaquille replied, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "And accountability." "I'm learning that," Linda acknowledged. "Slowly, but I'm learning." Across the room, Zoe watched the exchange with a complex mix of emotions. Pride in her mother's courage, lingering embarrassment about the situation, and a new understanding of how difficult and necessary it was to acknowledge one's mistakes, publicly. Meanwhile, Trevor Wilkinson observed the same interaction with poorly concealed frustration, his attempt to position himself as Oakridge's moral compass, thoroughly undermined by both his ex-wife's genuine contrition and his daughter's public rebuke. As residents gradually dispersed into the warm evening, something had shifted in Oakridge Estates. The carefully maintained veneer of perfection had cracked, revealing the messy, complicated community beneath, one capable of both prejudice and growth, exclusion and connection, harm and healing. The meeting hadn't resolved everything. Linda's apology didn't erase years of selective enforcement. New guidelines wouldn't instantly transform community culture. But as Diane stood with Mrs. Patel, watching their neighbors depart in animated conversation rather than polite silence, she felt a cautious hope. "Do you think anything will really change?" she asked the older woman. Mrs. Patel considered the question with the wisdom of her years. "Change has already begun," she replied. "The question now is whether we have the courage to sustain it." In the parking lot, Linda and Zoe walked toward their car, the weight of the evening's emotions evident in their silence. As they reached the vehicle, Zoe spoke. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "That couldn't have been easy." Linda looked at her daughter, surprised by the unexpected approval. "It wasn't, but it was necessary." "Yeah," Zoe agreed, a small smile forming. "It was." As they drove away from the clubhouse, Linda caught a glimpse of Shaquille in her rearview mirror, standing tall amid a group of residents, his presence both exceptional and somehow right at home. The pain of recognition passed through her again, not just of who he was, but of who she had been and who she might yet become. The gates of Oakridge Estates stood open as residents departed, no longer separating an exclusive enclave from the world outside, but framing a community in the midst of redefining itself and the standards that truly mattered. The community meeting had reached its emotional peak with Linda's initial apology, but as she remained at the podium, something shifted in her demeanor. The carefully rehearsed words she'd prepared seemed suddenly inadequate in the face of the real people before her, neighbors whose daily lives had been affected by her actions, not abstract concepts like community standards or property values. Linda set aside her note cards, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edges of the podium. "I had a statement prepared," she admitted, her voice softer now, more authentic. "But standing here, looking at all of you, I realize, prepared. Statements are part of the problem. They're safe, controlled, like the image of Oakridge I've been so determined to maintain." The room fell into deeper silence, residents leaning forward imperceptibly. "The truth is simpler and harder than what I'd planned to say," Linda continued. "I've been wrong. Not just about Mr. O'Neal's vehicle, but about many things for many years." She paused, visibly struggling to maintain her composure. "I've enforced rules unequally. I've scrutinized some residents more closely than others. I've made assumptions about people based on their names, their appearances, their cultural practices. And I've justified it all by telling myself I was protecting our community, when in reality I was defining our community in ways that excluded many of the people sitting in this room right now. From his seat in the back, Shaquille watched Linda's transformation with quiet attention. There was no satisfaction in his expression, only thoughtful assessment of her sincerity. "I can't undo the harm I've caused," Linda acknowledged, her voice breaking slightly. "The violation notices that ruined weekends, the denied permissions that spoiled celebrations, the subtle message that some of you didn't quite belong here." She looked directly at the Rodriguez family, then at Mrs. Patel, then at Dr. Chen. "I'm deeply sorry, not because I was caught or exposed, but because what I did was wrong, and because it took me far too long to see it." As Linda stepped back from the podium, the silence in the room felt different, no longer tense with anticipation, but heavy with the weight of truth finally spoken aloud. Diane returned to the microphone. "Thank you, Linda, for your honesty." She turned toward the back of the room. "Mr. O'Neal, would you like to respond?" All eyes shifted to Shaquille as he rose, his tall frame commanding attention without effort. He made his way to the front of the room, nodding respectfully to Linda as she returned to her seat. "First, I want to thank everyone who's shared their experiences tonight," he began, his deep voice carrying easily through the clubhouse. "It takes courage to speak truth, especially in spaces where you've been made to feel your voice isn't valued." Several residents nodded in acknowledgement. "To Ms. Wilkinson," Shaquille continued, turning slightly toward Linda, "I accept your apology. It's evident that you're beginning a difficult process of self-reflection, and that deserves recognition." He paused, his expression serious. "But I also want to be clear. Acceptance isn't the same as instant forgiveness or immediate trust. Those have to be earned through consistent actions over time." Linda nodded, accepting this boundary without protest. "What matters now," Shaquille continued, addressing the room at large, "isn't just acknowledging past mistakes but creating systems that prevent their repetition, not because someone might get caught on video, but because we genuinely value each member of this community." His words resonated through the room, setting the tone for what would follow. "I bought a home in Oakridge because I wanted a safe, beautiful place where my children could feel welcome when they stay with me. That's what everyone in this room wants, to feel at home, to belong, to be valued as neighbors rather than judged as outsiders." As Shaquille returned to his seat, Ronald Barker rose, recognizing that the moment demanded more than damage control. The HOA president looked uncharacteristically subdued as he approached the podium. "In light of tonight's discussion and Ms. Wilkinson's resignation," he began, his voice lacking its usual confident tenor, "I believe Oakridge would be best served by new leadership." He straightened his shoulders with a final attempt at dignity. "I hereby tender my resignation as HOA president effective immediately." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Ronald had been president for nearly a decade, his authority rarely questioned until now. "I also propose," he continued, "that we establish an interim leadership committee to guide us through this transition and the development of reformed policies." Diane stepped forward. "That's a constructive suggestion. Perhaps we could take nominations from the floor for this committee." What followed was unlike any HOA process Oakridge had previously experienced. Rather than the usual rubber stamping of pre-selected candidates, residents actively engaged in nominating diverse representatives. Dr. Gupta, Mrs. Patel, Alan Rodriguez, and several others were quickly suggested. Notably, when Trevor Wilkinson attempted to nominate himself, citing his legal expertise, he was politely but firmly passed over in favor of residents who had demonstrated genuine commitment to community improvement. "I'd like to nominate Diane Chen to chair this committee," Mrs. Patel announced. "She has shown exceptional leadership during this difficult time." Diane looked surprised. "I appreciate the nomination, but I'm not sure I'm the right person. I've only been on the board for a year and my medical practice." "That's precisely why you're the right person," Mrs. Patel interrupted gently. You bring fresh perspective and have demonstrated a commitment to fairness that this community needs. The vote was nearly unanimous, with Diane accepting the responsibility with characteristic grace and humility. As the formal meeting concluded, and residents began to disperse in small groups, Shaquille approached Linda, who stood somewhat apart from the others. Ms. Wilkinson, he said, his voice pitched for her ears alone. Could I have a word? Linda nodded, following him to a quiet corner of the room. Zoe watched from a distance, concern evident in her expression. I wanted to thank you, Shaquille began, surprising Linda. Not for the apology itself, but for its authenticity. That couldn't have been easy. It wasn't, Linda admitted. But it was necessary. Long overdue, actually. Shaquille studied her for a moment. You know, in basketball, there's a difference between players who apologize for missing a shot and those who work on their form so they don't miss the next one. Linda understood the metaphor. I want to be the second kind. I know words aren't enough. They're a start, Shaquille acknowledged. The follow-through is what matters now. I understand that trust has to be earned, Linda said, and that some people may never fully trust me again. I have to accept that as a consequence of my actions. Shaquille nodded, respecting her awareness. One question, if I may. What will you do now? Linda hadn't expected this. I'm not sure. Step back from the HOA, obviously. But beyond that, she glanced toward her daughter, who was speaking with a group of younger residents. I think I have a lot to learn from Zoe's generation about what true community looks like. That's a good place to start, Shaquille agreed. He extended his hand. I hope the home I create here will be part of a neighborhood where we all feel we belong. Linda shook his hand, the simple gesture symbolizing not closure, but the beginning of a different relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than assumed authority. I hope so too, she replied sincerely. As they parted, Linda made her way to where Zoe stood. Her daughter regarded her with a complex mix of emotions, pride, lingering embarrassment, and something like cautious hope. You did it, Zoe said, simply. I tried, Linda replied. It's just a beginning. Zoe nodded, understanding the distinction. So what happens now? Linda looked around the room, at neighbors talking openly with one another, at Diane conferring with the newly formed committee, at the space that had been transformed from a site of confrontation to one of potential growth. Now comes the harder part, she answered honestly. Living differently. Across the room, Trevor Wilkinson observed his ex-wife and daughter with barely concealed frustration. His attempts to position himself advantageously had been rebuffed, his calculated charm insufficient in a moment that demanded authenticity. As residents filed past him without seeking his input, the superficiality of his approach was thrown into sharp relief. Meanwhile, Ronald Barker stood in conversation with several longtime board members, their expressions somber as they discussed the transition ahead. For years they had congratulated themselves on maintaining Oakridge's exclusivity, never questioning whether their definitions of desirable residence might be shaped by unconscious biases. That comfortable certainty had been permanently disrupted. As the clubhouse gradually emptied, Diane found herself alone with the responsibility she'd somewhat reluctantly accepted. She was reviewing notes at a corner table when Shaquille approached. Congratulations, Chairperson Chen, he said with a warm smile. Diane laughed softly. I'm still not sure how that happened. I am, Shaquille replied. You've demonstrated integrity and vision when both were needed. That's leadership. It's a big undertaking, Diane admitted. Changing established patterns isn't easy. No, Shaquille agreed. But it's worth doing, and you won't be doing it alone. He nodded toward the parking lot where residents continued conversations in small groups rather than retreating immediately to their separate homes. There's energy for change here now. The challenge will be sustaining it beyond this moment. Will you be part of that? Diane asked. The renovations on your house must be nearly ready to resume. I will, Shaquille confirmed. This isn't just an investment property for me. It's a home for my family, at least part-time. And I want it to be in a community that reflects the values I want to teach my children." As they walked out together, Diane felt both the weight of responsibility and the lift of possibility. The gates of Oakridge Estates were more than physical barriers. They had become symbolic boundaries between insiders and outsiders, between those who automatically belonged and those who had to prove their belonging. Tonight had been the first step toward reimagining what lay within those gates, not just manicured lawns and expensive homes, but a community capable of accountability, growth, and genuine inclusion. In the parking lot, Linda and Zoe prepared to leave, their relationship altered by the evening's events, not healed completely, not instantly transformed, but shifted towards something more honest. "I've been thinking," Linda said as they reached the car. "Maybe it's time I learned more about your friends, your interests, the things that matter to you." Zoe looked at her mother with surprise. "Really? Really?" Linda confirmed. "I've spent too long judging things I didn't understand. I'd like to try a different approach." Zoe considered this for a moment. "My friend Jazz is having an art exhibition next weekend. Her work deals with cultural identity and belonging. You could come if you want." "I'd like that," Linda replied, meaning it. As they drove home through the quiet streets of Oakridge, the community Linda had sought to control now seemed more complex, more multidimensional than she had allowed herself to see. The stately homes were not just displays of wealth and taste, but containers for human lives with all their complications, aspirations, and unique expressions. The realization was both humbling and oddly liberating. Back in the clubhouse, Diane and the newly formed committee continued their preliminary discussion of HOA reforms. Their task was substantial, reviewing years of policies and practices, establishing new procedures for consistent enforcement, creating mechanisms for community input. But as they worked into the evening, there was a sense of purpose that transcended bureaucratic procedure. "We're not just changing rules," Mrs. Patel observed. "We're changing culture. That takes time and persistence." Alan Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "And transparency. No more selective enforcement or unwritten exceptions." "The question at the heart of everything," Diane added, "is who gets to decide what and who belongs in Oakridge. For too long, that power has been concentrated in too few hands." As the meeting finally concluded late into the evening, the committee members departed with assignments and a timeline for reconvening. The transformation of Oakridge Estates would not happen overnight, but the foundation had been laid. In her car, Diane sat for a moment before starting the engine, reflecting on the day's events. The confrontation that had begun with a violation notice on Shaquille O'Neal's door had expanded into something far more significant. A community reckoning, with its implicit hierarchies and unspoken exclusions. She thought of Linda's painful but necessary public accountability, of Shaquille's measured response balancing acceptance with clear boundaries, of residents speaking truths long kept silent. There had been no easy resolution, no instantaneous healing, but rather the beginning of a process that would require continued courage and commitment. As Diane finally drove home through the gates of Oakridge, she passed Shaquille's property, where construction equipment stood ready to resume. The renovations that would transform the Palmer mansion into a home reflecting its new owner's needs and tastes. The metaphor wasn't lost on her. Oakridge itself was under renovation, its structural foundation solid but its interior in need of significant reimagining. The true test would come in the days and weeks ahead, as the immediate emotional impact of the community meeting faded and the harder work of sustained change began. Would Linda's accountability translate into consistent growth? Would Ronald and the former board members support new leadership or resist changes to their established order? Would Trevor continue his self-serving positioning or find a more authentic way to contribute? Most importantly, would the residents of Oakridge, all of them, regardless of tenure, background, or status, commit to building a community where belonging wasn't determined by conformity to narrow standards, but by mutual respect and shared humanity? These questions remained to be answered. But as the lights of homes glowed warmly in the evening darkness, There was reason for cautious hope. The silence that had allowed exclusion to flourish had been broken, voices long muted had been heard, and in that difficult, necessary truth-telling lay the possibility of something better, a neighborhood defined not by gates and restrictions, but by genuine community. The Palmer Mansion, once the crown jewel of Oakridge Estates' old guard, had undergone a transformation that symbolized the broader changes within the community. The Mediterranean facade remained largely intact, honoring the home's architectural heritage, but the interior had been reimagined to reflect its new owners' needs and personality. Doorframes had been heightened, spaces opened up, and a warmth infused that replaced the previous formal austerity. 6 months after the confrontation that had catalyzed Oakridge's reckoning, Shaquille O'Neal stood on his expansive back patio, watching as neighbors mingled in the garden, where a half-court basketball area now shared space with sculptural landscaping and comfortable gathering spots. His housewarming party had drawn a diverse cross-section of the community, longtime residents alongside newer homeowners, families with children racing around the property while adults enjoyed the catered spread. "Quite a transformation," observed Diane Chen, joining him at the edge of the patio. Her 6 months as interim HOA chairperson had given her a quiet confidence that complemented her natural reserve. "Both the house and the crowd." Shaquille smiled, surveying the scene. "The renovation went more smoothly than expected once we got past the initial welcoming committee." They shared a knowing look, the reference to the violation notice that had started everything requiring no further explanation. "The new HOA guidelines have been officially ratified," Diane informed him. "Unanimous approval from the board last week." "Congratulations," Shaquille replied sincerely. "That's significant progress in a short time." "Progress with some resistance," Diane acknowledged. "Change is never entirely smooth, especially in a community as established as Oakridge." They watched as a group of teenagers, including Zoe Wilkinson, gathered around the outdoor sound system, negotiating their musical contribution to the party. Among them were faces reflecting the diversity of the surrounding communities, something rarely seen at Oakridge functions in previous years. "Your daughter seems to be thriving," Diane noted, nodding toward Zoe, who was animatedly describing something to her friends, her confidence evident in her gestures and posture. "She's splitting her time between here and her mother's," Shaquille explained. "The stability has been good for her, and she's found her own community within Oakridge." Across the garden, a new family was being introduced around by Alan Rodriguez, the Kims who had purchased the Stevenson property the previous month. Mr. Kim, an oncologist, and his wife, a concert pianist, moved through the gathering with the slightly tentative air of newcomers, but the warm reception from their neighbors stood in stark contrast to the scrutiny that would have awaited them just months earlier. "The welcome packet has been completely redesigned," Diane told Shaquille, observing the Kims' introduction. "Practical information instead of a 20-page list of restrictions, and new residents are paired with community guides to help them settle in, volunteers who introduce them around and help navigate the transition." "Smart approach," Shaquille approved. "First impressions matter." From the driveway came the sound of a new arrival. Linda Wilkinson stepped into the garden, carrying a potted plant and looking simultaneously determined and hesitant. Her appearance had softened somewhat over the months, her sharp bob grown out into a gentler style, her makeup less severe, her clothing more relaxed though still impeccable. The reaction to her arrival was mixed. Some neighbors greeted her warmly, others acknowledged her with polite reserve, and a few deliberately continued their conversations as if she hadn't appeared. Linda accepted this varied reception with a composure that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. "She's been working with a diversity consultant," Diane mentioned quietly. "Her idea, not imposed. Weekly sessions since the community meeting." Shaquille nodded thoughtfully. "Actions speak louder than apologies." "They do," Diane agreed. "She's also volunteering with the Community Outreach Program, helping coordinate Oakridge's participation in the county-wide affordable housing initiative." This was new information to Shaquille, and his expression registered genuine surprise. "That's unexpected." "Growth often is," Diane replied with a small smile. She'll never be the most progressive voice in the room, but the change seems genuine. They watched as Linda made her way toward them, navigating the social currents with new humility. Several residents nodded greetings, the frost of previous months thawed if not entirely melted. Mr. O'Neal, Linda said as she reached them, extending the potted plant. A housewarming gift. It's a Japanese maple. They're remarkably resilient and adapt well to various conditions. The symbolism wasn't lost on any of them. Shaquille accepted the gift with grace. Thank you, Ms. Wilkinson. I appreciate the thoughtfulness. Your home is beautiful, Linda continued, glancing around at the renovated property. You've honored its character while making it truly yours. That was the goal, Shaquille acknowledged. Respecting what came before while creating something that works for my family now. Again, the parallel to Oakridge itself hung in the air, unspoken but understood. If you'll excuse me, Diane said, sensing they might benefit from a moment of privacy. I should check on the Kims. First community gathering can be overwhelming. As she moved away, Linda's posture relaxed slightly. I wasn't sure if I should come today, she admitted. But Zoe insisted it was important to show up even when it's uncomfortable. Smart daughter, Shaquille observed. Smarter than her mother in many ways, Linda agreed with a self-deprecating smile. She's starting a diversity initiative at her school, you know, directly inspired by what happened here. I've heard, Shaquille replied. She mentioned it to my son, Sharif. They've become friends of sorts. Linda nodded, watching as Zoe laughed with her friends near the basketball court. She's finding her own path, less concerned with appearances, more focused on substance. Good lessons to learn young, Shaquille said, then added with gentle directness. Though they're valuable at any age. Linda met his gaze, acknowledging the reference to her own ongoing education. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have been able to stand in this garden surrounded by neighbors who had seen me at my worst. I'd have been too focused on my reputation, my standing. And now? Shaquille prompted. Now I understand that being part of a community isn't about status or control, Linda replied. It's about contribution and connection. I'm still learning what that looks like in practice, but I'm committed to the process. Before Shaquille could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of a car slowing on the street outside. Through the decorative iron fence, they glimpsed Ronald Barker driving past, slowing to look at the gathering before continuing on without stopping. Some bridges take longer to rebuild than others, Linda observed, following Shaquille's gaze. If they're rebuilt at all, Shaquille added realistically. The former HOA president had resigned his position but remained in Oakridge, though he had withdrawn from community activities. His reputation, like Linda's, had suffered, but unlike her, he had chosen isolation over accountability. Their contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of a small commotion. Trevor Wilkinson, immaculately dressed as always, attempting to join the party through the side gate. He was being politely but firmly redirected by one of Shaquille's security team, who explained that the event was by invitation only. I assumed my daughter's presence implied my welcome, Trevor was saying, his lawyer's voice pitched to Carrie. As Zoe's father and a longtime resident, Dad? Zoe had noticed the disturbance and approached with visible embarrassment. What are you doing here? Coming to support my community, of course, Trevor replied smoothly. I've been meaning to connect with Shaquille about some business opportunities that might be mutually beneficial. Zoe's expression hardened. This isn't a networking event. It's a private party. Surely there's room for a little neighborly connection. Trevor persisted, still performing for the benefit of onlookers even as his daughter's discomfort became increasingly evident. Linda moved toward them, her protective instinct overriding her usual avoidance of Trevor. Zoe, why don't you rejoin your friends, she suggested quietly. I'll handle this. For once, Trevor seemed taken aback by his ex-wife's direct intervention. Linda, I'm simply trying to— No, you're not, she interrupted calmly. You're trying to use this gathering for personal advantage, as you've done with every aspect of what happened here. Trevor's practiced smile faltered. That's a rather uncharitable interpretation of... It's an accurate one, Linda cut in. And it's exactly why you weren't invited today. Some lessons take longer to learn than others. The echo of Shaquille's earlier words to her was intentional, a reflection of her own ongoing journey. Trevor registered the parallel with a flash of genuine anger breaking through his polished facade. You've certainly pivoted quickly to the role of reformed community champion, he observed sarcastically. Very convenient rehabilitation. Not quick and not convenient, Linda corrected him. Necessary and ongoing. There's a difference. Their exchange had drawn attention from nearby guests, creating an uncomfortable echo of the confrontation 6 months earlier. This time, however, it was Trevor who found himself exposed, his calculated self-interest laid bare beside Linda's imperfect but genuine attempts at growth. After a tense moment, Trevor recovered his composure with visible effort. Well, it seems my presence isn't welcome today. Please give my regards to our host. He retreated with as much dignity as he could muster, though the damage to his carefully cultivated image was evident in the whispers that followed his departure. Linda returned to where Shaquille stood, slightly shaken by the confrontation but also aware of having passed a test of sorts, prioritizing her daughter's well-being and the community's peace over the appearance of family unity that Trevor had always insisted upon maintaining in public. Sorry about that, she offered. Trevor has always been skilled at inserting himself where he can gain advantage. No apology necessary, Shaquille assured her. Some people prioritize looking good over being good. It's an important distinction. As the afternoon progressed into evening, the gathering took on the relaxed rhythm of genuine community connection. Children played basketball on the half-court while teenagers congregated around the fire pit. Adults moved between conversation clusters, many talking to neighbors they had previously only nodded to in passing. Zoe found her mother sitting alone, for a moment on one of the garden benches, observing the scene with a pensive expression. "You okay?" she asked, dropping down beside Linda. "Better than okay," Linda replied sincerely. "Just reflecting." Zoe followed her gaze across the garden, where the diverse gathering represented a vision of Oakridge that would have been unrecognizable a year earlier. "It's different now, isn't it?" "Very," Linda agreed. "And for the better, though I wouldn't have believed that 6 months ago." "You're different too, Mom," Zoe observed, leaning against her mother's shoulder in a gesture of affection that had become increasingly common in recent months. "In good ways." Linda put her arm around her daughter, grateful for the second chance their relationship had been given. "I'm trying to be. Every day." As twilight deepened and outdoor lighting transformed the garden into a softly glowing sanctuary, Shaquille gathered everyone for a brief toast. "I want to thank you all for welcoming my family to Oakridge," he began, his deep voice carrying easily across the gathering. "When I purchased this home, I was looking for a place my children would feel safe, valued, and at home during their time with me." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled neighbors. "What I've found here is more than a house or even a neighborhood. I've found a community in the process of defining itself, not by what it excludes but by what it embraces." Glasses were raised in acknowledgement, the significance of his words resonating differently with each resident based on their unique experience of Oakridge's transformation. "To new foundations," Shaquille concluded, raising his glass, "and to the ongoing work of building upon them." As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Linda found herself in a quiet moment with Shaquille near the front entrance, where he was thanking neighbors as they left. "Thank you for including me today," she said sincerely. "It meant a lot, especially to Zoe." "You're part of this community," Shaquille replied simply. "The journey we've all been on these past months has been challenging but necessary." Linda nodded in agreement. "I used to think I knew exactly what Oakridge should be, who belonged and who didn't, what standards mattered most." "And now?" Shaquille asked, repeating his question from earlier. "Now I understand that true standards aren't about appearance or conformity," Linda replied thoughtfully. "They're about how we treat each other, How we make space for difference, how we grow through conflict rather than avoid it. Shaquille considered her words. That's a more demanding standard in many ways. Yes, Linda acknowledged, and a more meaningful one. As the last guests departed and Shaquille's children helped gather empty glasses from around the garden, Linda and Zoe walked together toward their car. The gates of Oakridge Estates stood open before them, no longer symbolic, barriers between insiders and outsiders, but simply the entrance to a neighborhood still in the process of becoming something new. Do you think it will last? Zoe asked, glancing back at Shaquille's illuminated home. All the changes, I mean. Linda considered the question seriously. Some will, some won't. Real change isn't a single event or policy. It's a commitment renewed, every day in 1,000 small choices. That sounds exhausting, Zoe observed with teenage directness. Linda laughed softly. It can be, but it's also liberating in ways I wouldn't have understood before. As they drove through the quiet streets of Oakridge, Linda noticed details she would have previously overlooked. The diverse architectural touches new homeowners had added to traditional facades, the varied cultural influences in garden designs, the unique expressions of identity that had always been present, but suppressed beneath rigid conformity. The community was still exclusive in the economic sense. The homes remained among the most expensive in the region, but something fundamental had shifted in its character. The unspoken hierarchy that had once defined belonging had given way to a more inclusive understanding of community, one that valued contribution over conformity, connection over control. It wasn't perfect. Some residents still resisted the changes, clinging to the old order. Others embraced the new direction, superficially performing inclusion without fully understanding its implications. And the structural inequities that made communities like Oakridge accessible to so few remained largely unchallenged. But within these limitations, something genuine had taken root. A willingness to question assumptions, to listen to different perspectives, to recognize that standards of belonging weren't objective truths, but collective choices that could be remade with intention and care. As Linda pulled into her driveway, she noticed Mrs. Patel tending her front garden despite the evening hour, the scent of jasmine from her carefully cultivated plants now drifting freely without complaint from neighbors who had once found it too ethnic. I'm going to help Mrs. Patel with her community garden project tomorrow, Zoe mentioned as they got out of the car. Want to come? She's teaching us about plants from different cultural traditions. 6 months ago, Linda would have dismissed such an invitation with a vague excuse about HOA responsibilities. Tonight, she found herself nodding. I'd like that. She's been gardening longer than I've been alive. I'm sure I could learn something. Zoe smiled, recognizing the significance of her mother's response. Cool. We start at 9. As they entered their home, still immaculate but somehow warmer than before, with books left open and projects in progress rather than hidden away, Linda reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The viral video that had exposed her worst self had also, paradoxically, created space for her better self to emerge. The public humiliation had led to private growth, the loss of status to the discovery of more meaningful connection. Across Oakridge, similar transformations were unfolding in ways both visible and unseen. Diane Chen leading the HOA with thoughtful integrity rather than rigid control. The Rodriguez family hosting cultural celebrations that enriched the community rather than threatened its standards. New residents welcomed as contributors rather than scrutinized as potential disruptors. The work was ongoing, imperfect, sometimes halting. But as Linda prepared for bed that night, she felt something that had been absent in her life for longer than she cared to admit. Not the satisfaction of maintaining appearances or enforcing standards, but the deeper fulfillment of genuine belonging to a community that was learning, however imperfectly, to make space for all its members. And in a neighborhood defined for so long by its gates that open-heartedness might be the most revolutionary standard of all. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.